DFIs. And this research shows that you can actually do it, and it creates a very useful tool to assess, you know, the performance and the policies of DFIs.
Great, thank you, Kies. I want to hand over to my colleagues Dayan and Zara, and they will essentially take us through the findings, the specific findings that we have in respect of the DBSA and the IDC. Dayan, Zara, please go ahead.
Hi, thanks, Dan. Can you hear us?
Yes, loud and clear. Thank you.
Perfect. So development finance institutions, or DFIs, are public institutions that offer long-term strategic finance and investments in the private and public sector. In other words, they provide the capital required for development, and they do this by funding companies or construction of infrastructure and industrialization that enables productive capacity, creates jobs, and builds wealth. Excuse me? There are two DFIs in South Africa, the Development Bank of Southern Africa and the Industrial Development Corporation. They're both established by legislation which sets out their mandate, which in general is to promote economic development and growth. They both operate within strategic sectors. The DBSA is focused on large infrastructure development in water, energy, transport, and ICT, for example. The IDC is focused on industrial development and financing companies in mining, agriculture, manufacturing, and tourism, telecommunication sectors. These DFIs provide public funding to industries with potentially high environmental impacts, whether they're positive or negative, and they both provide financing and investment in renewable energy. They have the ability to provide financing necessary for achieving sustainable development and a just transition.
So these South African DFIs have this mandate to promote economic growth. And although they must conduct their activities within this legislative mandate, they do have crucial decision-making powers when it comes to their finance and investment policies. So ultimately, they are responsible for setting in these policies the criteria with which companies and projects must qualify for their funding and for the conditions on which that funding must be used. So these policies serve as a crucial tool that can direct the DFI's capital towards more socially responsible and sustainable projects. Sorry, 1 second, we're having a bit of a problem with our PowerPoint. Okay, there we go. Both the DBSA and the IDC have committed to promoting sustainable development in their vision and mission statements. And so the question is then whether their policies actually reflect those commitments. As an environmental justice organization focused particularly on South Africa's mining and energy sectors, we were particularly interested in whether these DFIs had policies in place to ensure the protection of our environment in their financing activities and to facilitate a just transition in South Africa.
So what was assessed? We looked into 152 elements contained in the International Social, Environmental, and Human Rights Standard that Juliet's referred to. These were grouped into the 7 themes and 2 sectors. But the CEO focused on the DBSA and the IDC, who ranked 4th and last, respectively. For the purposes of this presentation and our report, we also narrowed the focus of our analysis to the climate change and the power generation sectors, which is in line with our focus and organization. Some general comments on interpreting the findings or explanations, why the South African DFIs did not do so well in climate change, was that the assessment only considers publicly available finance and investment policies. So finance and investment policies, practices are not included. DFI policies might be subject to political influence and are required to reflect, required to reflect public policy objectives of the government of the day. The state of development may also influence the country's commitments to certain standards, as some governments and DFIs argue that they're unable to set certain standards because of developmental imperatives. But what these results show is that this should not be used as an excuse. Looking at the score of the African Development Bank, it performed relatively well on most themes. It ties with the European Investment Bank on human rights, and it scores the highest for the power generation sector. And the point is that different levels of development should not affect policy commitments. Turning to the Industrial Development Corporation, it performed worst of all the DFIs assessed. The scores were awarded, if you have a look at the scores, you'll notice that on most themes it scored 0, and it came in below average on all of them. And the reason was simply that the IDC had not disclosed its policies publicly. So the scores awarded were based on statements in its integrated annual report. And we know, having looked at this, that if the IDC had made its policies publicly available, it would have helped to perform better. And this is because in the integrated annual report, a number of policies were set out. And when we requested these policies from the IDC did not provide them. We know that the environmental and social policy and the responsible investment policy were particularly important. However, eventually, after the opportunity to comment was closed, the IDC sent us the code of ethics and their business conduct, but by that point it was too late to take that into account. We believe that at the least these policies must be disclosed because policies enable companies seeking finance to understand the standards and the conditions that they must meet. But more importantly, public institutions must remain accountable to the public. And these policies enable us, the public, to analyze DFI's decision-making and their requirements for investees' compliance with environmental, social, and governance standards. So turning to the climate change and power generation sector specifically, in the absence of the IDC's policies, we couldn't conclusively say that their policies do not support sustainability imperatives. So we looked into the practices of the IDC. And what we found was that for the financial year 2018-19, at least 20% of the finance went to renewables, but around 14% went to companies reliant on coal, which exacerbates South Africa's greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. So it was clear then that the IDC's policies do not support a just transition to a low carbon economy, even though we had not seen them.
So turning to the Development Bank of South Africa, the DBSA did much better in comparison to the IDC. It ranked 4th out of the 6 DFIs, with most of its policies being publicly available except for a few. It achieved comparatively good scores through having a comprehensive environmental and social standards framework, which is crucial for any DFI to have because it sets expectations for its clients and illustrates how a DFI plans on addressing sustainability in support of its developmental agenda. The DBSA achieved its highest scores under the nature, human rights, and power generation theme, and one of its lowest scores under climate change. Another interesting finding is that although the DBSA has established a grievance mechanism for communities that may be adversely impacted by its activities, the results show that the DBSA doesn't report on that mechanism, nor on its consultation with civil society. This aspect of transparency is particularly important for a DFI such as the DBSA, whose core mandate is to promote sustainable economic development, and whose financed activities have the potential to have adverse social and environmental impacts in South Africa. Now, it might seem strange that the DBSA scored so well on nature, human rights, and even on power generation, but not so well on climate change. Let's take a closer look at this. One of the things the power generation theme assessed was the extent to which the DBSA finances companies involved in renewable energy. The DBSA has made significant strides towards financing renewable energy through various green projects. For example, it contributed to our REAP program. It manages the South African Green Fund, and also the UN Green Climate Fund has accredited it last year. The climate change theme, on the other hand, assesses whether the DBSA's policies align with international climate change standards and whether it deals with climate change in a proactive way. So for example, it looks at whether the DBSA measures and reports the carbon footprint of its financing portfolio. Does it have a strategy to make its portfolio consistent with the internationally agreed 2-degree temperature increase limit in terms of the Paris Agreement? Does it have a strategy to transition to a low carbon economy, including a switch from fossil fuels to renewables? Although the DBSA has a climate change policy framework in place, it does not align with these international standards. More importantly, its energy sector investment framework is not publicly available. We understand that it's still in draft form, but once finalized, it will remain an internal document. So while these results show that the DBSA is committed to financing renewable energy, it also reveals the lack of a necessary accompanying shift away from fossil fuel financing. Neither the IDC nor the DBSA have fossil fuel exclusion policies, nor do they demonstrate any strong positions against fossil fuel financing. And there are two influencing factors behind this. The first is political intervention. Being state-owned institutions, DFIs are required to operate in line with public mandates and public policy, and this may influence their policies and decision-making. While South Africa's National Development Plan encourages a transition towards a low carbon economy, our Integrated Resource Plan, which is our national electricity plan, makes provision for 1,500 megawatts of new coal-based electricity in the country's energy mix. So this inconsistency between the DBSA's investment policies in terms of power generation and climate change can be seen as a direct reflection of the inconsistencies in our own public policies. In South Africa, mining continues to be seen as a primary driver of the economy, with coal as a vital export and the main source for energy. This minerals energy complex is reflected, for example, in the decision to merge our minerals and energy department last year. And as we have seen this minerals energy complex play out over the years, it continues to be a barrier to sustainable development in South Africa. Added to this is the increasing shift away from fossil fuel financing by commercial banks. As they are starting to pull out, the DFIs have become the funders of last resort for coal and coal infrastructure in South Africa. So a key challenge to policy formulation for these DFIs is this political influence.
Developmental imperatives also guide DFI decision-making. And here we must bear in mind that South Africa frequently tops the list as the most unequal country in the world. This inequality is structurally ingrained in our society as a result of apartheid, but today it's largely driven by unemployment. The effect is large disparities in wealth, access to basic resources and services, spatial injustice, widespread poverty, and so on. It can hardly be disputed that fixing unemployment and inequality is South Africa's highest developmental priority. But if unemployment is a key driver of inequality, then unemployment must be resolved urgently, and DFIs can play a key role there. However, DFIs must address developmental imperatives while ensuring long-term sustainability. The poorest members of our society are the most vulnerable to climate change and environmental impacts. And if DFIs fail to consider sustainability issues today, or if these DFIs view sustainability as less important than development, DFIs are setting the most vulnerable people in our population up for more intense effects of inequality, and harm caused by climate change further down the road. What we need to do is to flatten the curve by taking sustainability issues into account now. And this means that there's no binary choice between sustainability and development. DFIs must align their developmental imperatives with sustainability to achieve sustainable development. So how do they align their developmental mandates with climate-related goals? One way is to create decent jobs in renewable energy. Some ideas include building industrial capacity and improving South Africa's competitiveness in renewable and environmental goods manufacturing. This is particularly important for the IDC. They need to target investments in those parts of the value chain in the production of environmental goods and services that create the most jobs, or in the sectors of renewable energy or the types of renewable energies that create the most jobs. For example, they could focus on wind tower manufacturing or solar powered manufacturing if we can improve South Africa's productive capacity and competition within that area. They should grow demand for renewables, and here the DBSA can play a pivotal role in lobbying government, one of its partners in the Renewable Energy Independent Power Producer Program. They need to lobby government to roll out our renewable energy procurement rounds while ensuring the proper functioning of the Independent Power Producer Office without the burden of government intervention. But most importantly, they need to stop financing coal. When these DFIs provide funding, they must ensure that the companies and the projects that they fund comply with social, environmental, and human rights standards. This is important to realize a just transition, but also a just recovery from the effects of COVID-19. The IDC, for instance, provides a number of relief funds to support businesses. But to ensure a just recovery or green recovery, the IDC's finance and investment policies must ensure that recipients of these funds have a strategy to reduce direct and indirect emissions, that they adopt energy efficiency measures, that they comply with human rights and labor standards, strive towards gender equality, and adopt measures to prevent corruption, because solving today's crisis cannot lead us into another crisis tomorrow.
So where to from here for South African DFIs? DFIs can address the political influence over their policies and decision-making, particularly in relation to transitioning towards a low-carbon economy. They can do so by relying on their legislative mandates, by relying on their commitments in their vision and mission statements, on international standards and best practice, on our NDP, and on constitutional imperatives for a healthy environment. As civil society, we should use this basis as a framing for our continued engagement with these DFIs. While there's undoubtedly a need for economic development in South Africa, there's an equally important need to address the present and future impacts of climate change, particularly in a country such as South Africa, which is vulnerable to the impacts. We have strong environmental laws, but we have weak implementation and regulation. DFIs must remember that the right of our people to an environment that is not harmful to our health or well-being should not be seen as a mere trade-off and needs to be balanced with developmental goals. And we are saying that this balance can be achieved through sustainable development. The first step towards that is developing clear and ambitious policies aligned with environmental, human rights, and social standards. The current COVID-19 pandemic, coupled with the ongoing climate crisis, offers DFIs this unique opportunity to advance the sustainability agenda in South Africa. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan and Sarah, for an excellent presentation. So one of the questions that is coming through from Mish Koyama at the CER is around how DFIs define sustainable development. Do they have a standard vision of what they consider to be sustainable development? Is it consistent with the Constitution? And I'm hearing you say that, look, DFIs do have a vision and mission, but their practices and their policies don't necessarily reflect that. Very briefly, what are your views around this?
You can go.
Okay, so in our report, we do cover the issue of sustainable development to some extent. And it's interesting because, as Zara pointed out, both these DFIs do consider sustainable development, but they don't specifically define it. So we turned to the UN Sustainable Development Goals to see what sustainable development, how it is defined there. But we found that there was also an interesting correlation between the definition for sustainable development by the SDGs, as well as the Constitution of South Africa, that basically says that development must take into account not only the needs of the present, but also the needs of future generations. We didn't see that sort of assessment done by the DBSA and the IDC.
And just to add to that, the DBSA, its objectives are particularly aligned with the National Development Plan. And if you look at the National Development Plan, it has about a 70% convergence with the Sustainable Development Goals. So although the DBSA and IDC don't define sustainable development as such, their objectives are supposed to be aligned with the NDP, which is aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals.
Great. I see a comment coming through from Vivian Hobbs. and she appreciates that last slide, the last two slides, where we're looking at how do we move forward, and how do we move forward in a positive ways, in a positive way with civil society using the assessment, right, in order to engage with DFIs quite constructively, but also DFIs responding to the elements of the assessment, the more detailed assessment that appears on our website, and using it in order to align their policies with international standards. Thank you, Vivian. I see additional questions coming through from Richard Worthington. We will answer your question, Richard. We do want to move on to the next presentation, and we'll come back to that question. So Kirsten and Ahmed, having worked with financial institutions, Kirsten and Ahmed, 350, having done extensive work and advocacy work in respect of public finance, would you take us through your experiences in using research, in using various tools to advocate for change and to try and ensure that DFIs, other financial institutions, align their policies with international standards, address environmental, social, and governance concerns? Over to you, Kirsten Ahmed.
Hi, Leanne. Should I start? Oh. Okay.
Yes, thank you, Ahmed.
All right, cool. Hi, morning everyone. My name is Ahmed Mokhopo, and I am a campaigner with 350africa.org, which is a regional branch of 350.org, the international climate campaigning organization known for online campaigning, distributed grassroots organizing, as well as playing a role in the global divestment campaign. So just to provide some background, all right, so at the time that 350 began organizing the campaign targeting public finance institutions, the country was going through a wave of change with the resignation of President Jacob Zuma and the appointment of Cyril Ramaphosa as the country's new president. The Tumamina rallying call that emerged at the time was focused on accountability, on jobs, on investment, transparency, and good governance. And SOEs, and I'm sort of like putting public finance institutions into that same sort of category as SOEs for now, were being focused to re-examine their role and contribution to South Africa's growth. And with them being under greater public scrutiny, we felt that it was an opportune time for 350 to seize the mood and urge the DBSA to move away from financing coal. And our decision to target the DBSA was influenced by the Big Shift Global campaign, which was led by Climate Action Network, as well as Christian Aid, and getting support from civil society organizations from across the world, which were urging public finance institutions and specifically the World Bank to align their financing with the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals, and to ultimately shift financial flows in ways that would limit the worst impacts of climate change, and for them to instead enhance the resilience of vulnerable communities. Our aim at the time was to get the DBSA to publicly commit not to finance the Thabametsi coal power plant, which was one of the 2 power plants that made it through the first bid round of the coal IPP plan. And together with the Life After Coal Coalition and other partners, we began targeting the bank's board, employees, as well as politicians. And the idea was that the employees and the board could raise the issue within the bank and push the executive management at the bank to end their intention to finance Thabametsi. the bank's only shareholder is the Minister of Finance. And by targeting politicians, we could raise the issue of the DBSA funding Thabameti and also highlight how unsustainable infrastructure like new coal power plants would not be serving communities that most need access to energy. So coming into this work, there were a number of barriers that we had to overcome in order to try and build support and build a movement for the campaign. And one of the first was the bank's visibility and the public's awareness of the DBSA and what it does. And the DBSA themselves had described themselves, or at least described having a preference of being a behind-the-scenes development partner. And this was evident in a number of ways, making it really difficult to try and engage them without them having an active presence in social media, or at least being active in the public sphere. The second was that the DBSA doesn't have like a real civil society engagement strategy or policy. And so without like real internal systems to constructively engage them beyond the grievance mechanism, we organized a set of activities to get their attention, and also had to organize these activities to try and sustain our engagement with them. It's, I guess, worth noting that we had met the DBSA alongside some civil society partners at the beginning of the campaign, but following that meeting, there were no other avenues that we could have used to try and engage them, and so therefore had to create those opportunities for ourselves. And the last sort of challenge was the bank being transparent, and we issued a PIA request around the operational and financial due diligence used by the bank to inform their decision to fund Thabameti. They denied that request, and this unfortunately deepened our awareness and concern in the frameworks that they use to approach and evaluate energy financing. So to advance the campaign, the tactics listed here were just some of the ways we tried to highlight the linkages between climate change and sustainable development. And in all these activities, we recognized the DBSA's support for renewable energy initiatives in South Africa, but then also highlighted the fact that these positive steps that they're taking would risk being undermined by them pouring money into projects like Thabameti. So along with these activities and months-long engagements over our PIA appeal, this all led to the bank letting us know that their mandate to finance Thabameti had expired. So what this really meant was that a new proposal for funding from the Thabameti Power Company would be needed, and the DBSA would have to consider a fresh proposal, which then they would have had to benchmark on the environmental and other regulatory compliance requirements. To date, there hasn't been any fresh application for finance, but what this has meant is that without a specific policy on climate change, should a new application for finance emerge, the DBSA could potentially be required to finance a new coal power plant as a result of their political mandate or political pressure that might push them in that direction. And this is why we've decided to shift our framing in our public finance work and are now calling on the likes of the DBSA and IDC to come out with a fossil fuel finance exclusion policy. And in recent weeks have also begun trying to push the message that public finance institutions should instead be used to respond to crises like COVID-19 in a way that ensures a just recovery as well as a just transition to a better future that puts people's health first. So just to touch base on some of the opportunities that this assessment provides for engaging development finance institutions is that number one, it really does provide like damning evidence that the IDC is not doing nearly enough to disclose their commitment to sustainable development, and in particular to combating climate change. As a DFI, they should be holding themselves to the highest levels of transparency and ensuring that critical governance information is available to the public. This poor showing by the IDC in particular is an opportunity to push the message that good public finance institutions with clear mandates should be maximizing their development impact, thus boosting the public's confidence in them. Their focus should not be on profits, and while these institutions should maintain a minimum level of return, they have a crucial role in ensuring that their policies reflect a real commitment towards sustainable low carbon economic development and a just transition from fossil fuels. So just to wrap up, I just want to highlight that when we began working on targeting public finance institutions, an assessment like this would have been extremely beneficial in informing our approach in the sense of identifying the specific levers of change that we could have used to highlight a greater sense of urgency for the DBSA to act early on. For example, we could have forefronted our pushback on the Telemetsi situation with a climate policy and called for a fossil fuel exclusion policy ask early on in our engagements. But we didn't know what we know now about how politics influences their agenda, even though they are able to make decisions independently. Another thing is that, armed with the evidence of how these South African DFIs compared to some of their international peers, we have the opportunity to play them off against each other so that they can clean up their acts. And this ability to compare them to their peers could send a clear message that continuing to finance companies and infrastructure projects that exacerbate the climate crisis is unsustainable, presents a risk to society, and contradicts their mandates. And I think here lies an opportunity for us to really push for them to commit to align their financial flows with science-based targets of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees, and also to ask them to be transparent about the targets they establish to get there. Finally, the IDC's low scoring is a powerful framing to use to call on the institution to use COVID-19 as an opportunity to shift to greening its policies as well as its financing activities as part of calls for a just recovery that drives a transition to a low carbon economy. And while the DBSA was ranked 4th, they still have a long way to go to truly align with climate stability, and that a part of their response to the economic fallout of COVID-19 is an opportunity for the DBSA to stand out and be a leader amongst public financiers in South Africa. Thank you.
Thank you, Ahmed. Great. So can we move on to your presentation here? And I do see a number of questions coming through. We're going to have a question and answer session start immediately after this, and we hope to get to as many as possible.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, and can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. All right, so going back to the Fair Finance Network, let me share a little bit some experience with you. So we are a coalition of civil society organizations with a variety of expertise. We have a robust methodology to compare the policies of financial institutions, and we are linking very much to other civil society initiatives influencing the financial sector worldwide. How do we do this? We do policy assessments, and it is our experience that this helps to stimulate a race to the top, because you see that financial institutions really like to compare each other with other institutions that they consider to be in the same league. And our policy assessments give them the evidence that actually competitors are doing better in some aspects. So that gives good arguments for our allies within banks and financial institutions to do their internal lobby to improve their policy. You know? So to the good guys, we give positive publicity, and to the laggards, we give arguments to improve their policies. However, what we also see is that policy assessments are not enough, because policies often have inconsistencies, they often have loopholes. For example, a bank can have a very good policy for project loans, but then not apply this policy to corporate loans. So they can still end up financing, you know, destructive companies, even though they have a good project loan policy. So we, on the one hand, we have the policy assessment, and on the other hand, we have case studies and quick intervention cases. And then what we do is that we focus on a particular controversial project or sector on the ground, and then we start analyzing like which financial institutions are lenders or investors in this particular sector, and what do they do to tackle the problems that we find. And we think these two approaches of approaching it from the case studies and approaching it from the policy assessment is a strong combination, which increases our leverage on financial institutions. And the other thing we do is, of course, lobbying, advocacy, engaging with regulators. Well, let me show you some of the successes we achieved. First one is that you see is there is a worldwide divestment from coal and tar sands, and Zara already pointed it out that commercial banks are moving away from coal. And of course, this is not only due to our work, this is due to the work of many community organizations worldwide that are, you know, challenging coal-fired power plants and that are challenging the air pollution. It is due to many NGOs and civil society organizations worldwide that are working against, you know, the most polluting fossil fuels. And it's due to, you know, cold-hearted economic calculations from the financial institutions themselves, who realize that coal is really not a reliable economic investment anymore. Other thing we achieved is that several financial institutions divested from a private detention company, a company involved in setting up private prisons, privatized migrant detention centers, the company Geo, who is also active in South Africa, by the way. And we managed that a number of banks have divested from this company. We challenged abusive credit policies by banks in Brazil, in Indonesia, you know, banks giving abusive credits for, and putting consumers in debts. We've achieved that financial institutions are engaging with companies on a living wage, for example, in the garment sector in Bangladesh, the food sector. We achieved that financial institutions are engaging with pharmaceutical companies on affordable medicines. Banks have divested from tax evading companies. We achieved more transparency, which then in turn, of course, enables civil society organizations to engage much more with a financial institution. We achieved that banks are addressing deforestation caused by palm oil in Southeast Asia, soy in Brazil. We see that banks are now demanding much more from the companies they invest in to address deforestation risks. And the last example is specifically from the Netherlands, that we achieved that there is now a ban for financial institutions to invest in cluster munition. So how about a fair finance coalition in South Africa? We would very much welcome this idea. We think there is a big need for pressure on corporations and investments. And we think that in South Africa, the commercial banks and the development banks are very relevant targets that need lots of improvement. And this could also have a regional impact, as these banks play an important role in the whole African region. For us, it would be the first fair finance coalition on the African continent. And well, we would welcome this very much. And that was the end of my presentation. Over to you, Liane.
Great, thank you so much, Geers. We have a number of questions and comments coming through. I know that there are some representatives of both the DBSA and the IDC participating in this webinar. So before I move into questions for the panelists, perhaps I will read out some of these questions. And if those representatives would like to put up their hands, we can allow you to participate more fully in the webinar. Some of the questions coming through from Richard Worthington: have our DFIs reacted in any way to DMRE ministerial determinations? Anything about the lack of mention in the IPP office around procurement? Melisizwe Tiiso saying the way the REAP or the kind of call for procurement has been is an privatization of energy. We should be advocating for more investment of renewables at Eskom. We need a socially owned renewable energy, not privatized renewable energy. Then we have a question from Stanley Senamolele saying, to what extent do South African DFIs give into public demands like the refusal to fund the Thabametsi project? Friedemann Esrik is saying this suggests that in order to change DBSA and IDC policies, one would have to change ANC politics first. And question mark over, is that correct? Nicole Loesa from the CER saying the Department of Energy's coal IPP request for proposals specifically says that DFIs must support and assist the coal IPP projects, particularly those that meet BE requirements. Are there any thoughts to focus on the department's procurement processes and requirements on South African DFIs, which the DFIs say are binding on them? In other words, the typical DFI response is that their hands are tied by government policies. How do we get around that? So if there are any comments or responses from those representing DFIs in this webinar, please do raise your hand and we'd allow you to participate and answer. I have a question for, so in the meantime, I have a question for Ahmed, which comes from Louise Naudet at WWF. And her question is, what are the opportunities to influence the mandate of the IDC and DBSA to shape a just and green economy? Now, Ahmed, I know that you did go through some of this in your presentation, but if you would like to reflect further on this question, you're welcome to do so now.
Sure, thanks, Liane. And I guess as I mentioned in the presentation, and I'll speak more specifically to the DBSA because our experiences of engaging the IDC when we haven't yet engaged them in a meaningful way and are hoping to start doing that soon. But in the case of the DBSA, as I said, there weren't many opportunities, or at least formal opportunities for us to really engage the DBSA, and that we had to use creative tactics to try and begin having that engagement with them. And once we were able to sort of like get their attention around our campaign ask, we learned a lot from them in the sense that on the one hand, and I think it goes a lot to Nicole's comment around government's hands being tied, that on the one hand, there is they would like to set an agenda where they are not necessarily financing unsustainable infrastructure projects, but on the other hand, because of the fact that they have a political mandate, their hands are tied. And you know, for us, what that meant was we could not just like take that message of their hands being tied, lying down. We had to try and find new ways to continue engaging with the DBSA, and that's why we started, you know, targeting the Minister of Finance and calling on the DBSA themselves, or at least like trying to call their bluff and saying that while you say your hands are tied, you know, you guys could also really use this opportunity to try and push to set an agenda that doesn't require you to finance any unsustainable projects. And so in trying to use creative tactics to engage them, I think we can say that we were able to find a way to sustain our engagement with them, but without any formal sort of like platforms to do that. It has meant that every time we would have wanted to engage them, we would have to try and get their attention.
Thanks, Ahmed. I see there's a question from Michael Ward, which Dan and Zara have answered, and the question is around how could DFI support deeper and larger scale systemic change for a just transition? And the response is that the DBSA has already started grappling with this, and you can see this from its corporate plan for 2030. One of its key focus areas now includes navigating the just transition through smart partnerships. I see that Victoria has put up a hand in response to wanting to answer maybe some of these questions. Victoria, if you'd like to come in, you're welcome to do so. Okay, I'm not sure if Victoria is responding here. Well, I think without having any further responses from the DFIs that are participating in this call in terms of wanting to answer these really critical questions that everyone has raised during the course of this webinar, I think that what we could do is definitely engage further with the DFIs as we have planned to do through our advocacy, and answer these questions, have these questions answered through social media and other platforms, and definitely keep you posted on the answers. Well, we are scheduled to close at 11:15, and it's now 11:16. So I would really like to just thank you all for joining us here today, for raising your questions, for participating. And we really look forward to just engaging with you further on social media, and to send material and resources as our advocacy plans develop further. Yeah, and I see that there's some additional comments coming through. We will share a copy of this recording through our various social media platforms and via email. Thank you, and thank you for joining us all. Thank you to the panelists for their excellent presentations.
Thanks, Lara.
To just say goodbye to those participating in the webinar.
Thank you.
Cheers. Thanks everyone.
Thank you all. Goodbye.